In today's episode of the Analytical Podcast, we'll be talking about Karl Marx with Professor of Sociology Tim Bertoni. So one of the main questions that I have for you today is what do you think Marx's view on anti-Semitism and largely Judaism as a whole is?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Marx comes from a strong Jewish heritage, a strong lineage, actually, of rabbis. And interesting, his name was given at birth to be Mordecai. Was changed to Marcus later, and his father converted to Lutheranism. Interesting that there's this interesting relationship between Judaism and religious Judaism and political or national, maybe secular Judaism for Marx. He's coming out of the young Hegelian movement, so he's coming from the idealists to really his historical materialism. And he's pairing up with Engels really for the first time in Paris. I think they first published The Holy Family in 1844, which is a kind of a summary of a discussion and a critique of Marx's professor, Bruno Bauer, who was really an idealist, more of a Hegelian idealist, who was arguing, I think, ultimately that Jews needed to be eradicated in order for society to be free. And Marx critiques him really from a materialist perspective as, well, there's a distinction he fails to make between the idealist and the materialist view of Judaism. So in his discussion with this kind of Jewish question, as it's been titled, the Jewish question, how do the Jews interact in the modern capitalist society? Now, Marx and Bauer, his professor, are really coming from the Hegelian perspective. So I think that frames it nicely when you talk about the Hegelian dialectic, right, and the criticism and the synthesis model. So for Judaism, just from the idealist perspective, you got to think about the one and the many synthesizing into the one within the many, right? And the many within the one synthesis. So from Hegel, he theorized that really the God consciousness is revealed through human history, particularly through idealism, through religion, right? So the Jews were the thesis of monotheism, the one. Even ancient Greek had kind of elements, right? The one. And the one in the many problem. But the Jews synthesized really the notion of oneness. God is one. And so Hegel is theorizing again that the one in the many through history, God consciousness is coming to our consciousness, our awareness, self-consciousness in Christianity. So Christianity is the great synthesis between the one and the many, right? The Trinity, the many within the one within the many. And so I think that is, particularly in Germany, the eyes in which kind of the intellectual, at least the Hegelian community, and Marx is ultimately looking through. That Christianity is the essence, the synthesis, the final synthesis, right? I mean, it's the final synthesis. Hegelianism and the dialectic is the final synthesis. Everything else is just going to work out through, philosophy and the arts. Right? Religion has reached its final synthesis. So, in Christianity. So that really frames, I think, the beginning of the discussion from an idealist perspective. And I think Bauer can really expound upon that the Jews need to be, not citizens, not part of our community because they're holding back our consciousness, our societal, the civil society, as Hegel would say, right? They're holding back that synthesis, that explanation of the civil society because they reject, again, Christ, right? They're rejecting the one in the many. They're rejecting the Trinity. They're essentially rejecting the final synthesis. And then Marx brings in the critique of the idealists. And so having been trained, right, in the university even by Bauer, Marx criticizes his idealism with a materialist critique that is ultimately, well, he fails to make the distinction between, as Marx sees it, the religious Jew and the secular Jew, or the political Jew, I think is how he uses the term, the worldly Jew, yeah. And so I think he makes a further distinction between being free in the state you can be free, but ultimately in human terms, you're only free if religion is eradicated, right? So that's the full synthesis. So Marx can see that working itself out. I mean, he's a dialectical theorist, so it's in process. It seems that Bauer is very adamant on this point. Now, Marx, interestingly enough, right? I mean, he's got this strong Jewish heritage, just strong family heritage. But he seems, in Engels, he is writing The Holy Family, at least publishing it in 1844, before the Communist Manifesto. So we have, again, this basis of the Jews, in the secular sense, really monotheistically symbolizing the capitalist system, right? So the Jew for Marx is really the capitalist, right? In that the capitalist system is driven by money. So I think there's an interesting dialogue between how Marx describes the secular Jew as really the money god, right? The money worshiper, and loses their religious to their materialist position. So Marx makes that materialist move over to the practical kind of atheism of the Jewish community.
My main questions were having to do with, like, if you could expound kind of on what Marx meant by the practical Jew, or practical Judaism even, like what that means. And then as well, like, what was Marx's, like, religious affiliation? Like, was he Lutheran like his parents? Was he atheist? Like, where was his kind of religious allegiance lying?
Yeah, I think it seems to be on his mother's side, even and his father's side, that he was in line for being a rabbi, which is an interesting profession. His father converts because his father is a lawyer, I guess, and sees himself as not really progressing. So you have to sense there was some dissatisfaction with the religious Jew, and being able to give up your religion for the sake of the political economic means of life shows who your God is, right? I mean, so Marx is talking from personal experience, maybe his own father, right? That his dad had given up his religion for money, position, power, and prestige. So I think that's the practical Jew, right? The practical Jew is oriented toward observable commandments, doable physical actions, right? You think of the symbolism for the Jew, but it's worked out in the Passover. It's worked out in the feasts. It's worked out very practically and empirically, right? So the Jew is oriented toward that. I think that's what Marx is saying. And again, I think he has his own family's perspective, and his family's perspective is leading rabbis, right, of generations in Germany itself, right? So this is the height of Judaism. Marx's family is that kind of symbol, right? So I think from that perspective, he's saying the Jew is the practical expressing of their faith. And I think the picture really, if you can take it personally, that Marx sees what his dad has done is really symbolizing what the Jew has done in whole. Right? You gave up your religion so that you could have a career. And I think Marx, you're not the only one, Dad, right?
That's something interesting as well, because the character that we're looking at in the paper that I wrote is Menno Berg, and he actually was given the opportunity to abandon his faith to kind of progress in the military community. I mean, he was told to be, before being promoted to officership, the King of Prussia actually refused him personally. And he said, if you were baptized, he invited him to be baptized to get the officership. And Menno Berg actually refused.
Oh, no kidding.
And he wouldn't have gotten the officership had he not had a close relationship with the king's son, who defended Berg on behalf of I guess, himself, Berg. So that's an interesting thing as well, kind of seeing, I guess, almost a sort of an antithesis to Marx's view of Jews is actually Menno Berg, as he refused this sort of empirical view. He's not going to pursue a career above his religious views. Yeah. But something I would have mentioned as well is Marx's own economic standing, I guess, because he is kind of living he's practicing what he preaches, I guess you could say, because he isn't pursuing a career, at least a successful one, intentionally for some kind of outwards. I mean, by the time he dies, he's pretty poor and pretty unpopular, I believe, right?
Yeah. Marx never really got the university position, although he was, a PhD, and it's known that he really wasn't a rhetorician. He wasn't speaking in public often. He was a writer, and a quiet life. Lived a very quiet life in that sense, behind the scenes, revolutionary, but too radical for the university. So the person he's in discussion with, Bruno Bauer, was too radical, right, as a Hegelian, and kind of rejecting kind of this kind of extreme view of it. Well, Marx was even more of an extreme intellectual, and there just wasn't room for him in a conservative university. So he found his living writing pamphlets and selling his pieces even to the New York Tribune for years as a kind of an international correspondent during the Civil War in America, interestingly enough. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting as well, because when we first come across his question of the Jew manuscript, it was actually published in Paris. It wasn't. Yeah. It was first published, I think, by a small German publication, but it didn't gain any traction.
Yeah.
And so I think he actually sent it to a Perusian publication, and they actually published it for him on his behalf. So he was actually more popular in France than he was in Germany, Prussia at that time. So that's something you mentioned.
Yeah,
as well.
That's interesting. Yeah, that's where he meets Engels, and I think the Holy Family is their first collaboration, and I think it is published in Paris in 1844. So, yeah, interesting. And then, of course, where I'm interested in too is how Emile Durkheim, the French sociologist, who has a very similar story in the line of rabbis, becomes an atheist and becomes, a scholar of scholars and creating sociology in France. So I think there's an interesting trend. I think you've tapped into kind of, the modern dilemma of solidarity, right? How do you, in the urban city, in the new society, how do you keep your historical, ethnic religion? How do you synthesize? How do you work within this ancient identity into a modern age? And that's what they're struggling with, right? And Marx, of course, this is the heart of alienation, and religion and religious and political illusion need to, are like drugs, right, or opiates. So you need to get rid of them. What is interesting is that it seems that Bauer is much more eager to get rid of them than even Marx was, at making a distinction that, well, it's more of a process. He's kind of rushing the Hegelian process, maybe, and certainly criticizing him on ideological ends. But Marx makes the point again that for the Jew, the God of Israel is money, right? The new God is the God of money, and he now becomes the figure of capitalism itself. So Marx, the Jew becomes the capitalist in essence. And even the Christian, right, is really more like a Jew than a Jew, right? And so that they worship the same, right, in that sense.
Yeah, something he mentioned as well was, I think it was taking how many steps, he was talking about taking how many steps the Christians had to basically breaking free from this slavery of capitalism versus the Jews. Oh, okay. And he says the Jews have 2 steps to take, because first they have to overcome their own nature, their own capitalistic nature. Whereas the Christians only have to overcome one, which is what the capitalist nature has put them in. So it's an interesting distinction that Marx makes as well, with how close Christians and Jews are in sort of that capitalistic orientation, I guess you could say. Yeah, there's an interesting quote from Marx's piece on the question of the Jew, where he says, "Man emancipates himself politically from religion by banishing it from the sphere of public law to that of private law. Religion is no longer the spirit of the state in which man behaves, although in a limited way, in a particular form and in a particular sphere, as a species being in community with other men. Religion has become the spirit of civil society, of the sphere of egoism, of bellum hominum contra omnes. It is no longer the essence of community, but the essence of difference."
Interesting. Yeah, I think, again, there's a lot of Hegelian terminology in there.
So I guess an interesting question to pose would be, like, does Marx believe in a corporate form of worship, or is it more of a private affair in his understanding?
Yeah, I think clearly from the Hegelian perspective, it's part of civil society. Civil society isn't political society. It's not the state, right? So religion is separate from the state. And so it becomes a private affair. But for Marx, I think this is where he's making the distinction. You can have a state that is free and open, right? The individual can still be enslaved. So this is where Marx is going to be, again, kind of the process theorist, that the Jew or the Christian is still alienated from his essence because he doesn't realize himself, right? His famous thesis on religion is that it's an opiate. It expresses the real yearning, the real cry of the human heart, but it doesn't take hold of it, right? And I mean, Marx writes so powerfully on this, and I think maybe relevant for your study on Luther, that the German theologian Martin Luther, who started the Reformation, was he had the right movement, right? He had the right essence in that he was fighting religion, the oppression of religion. Yet he was a prophet, right, and not a philosopher. And that was his downfall, is that he took away the oppression of the state, as it were, right? The state of the Pope, the church, state and church relationship. Luther, took it out of the Holy Roman Empire, right? Took the holy, right? Took secular, made it, he created a religion away from the state religion. And so Marx, I think that's a great picture of how Marx sees religion, is that, Luther was right there. But what Luther did is that he brought the chains to his inner heart, right? So it was no longer, forbidden to go to church or forbidden to preach and to teach these theological doctrines that were heresy, right? But that you're free to do that, but you've now become the inner, you become a slave to yourself, right? Religion has, particularly Christianity, has enslaved the human soul, right? You're in a slave relationship. And I think that's how Marx sees religion. You can be, there's a distinction between the state and the civil society. And so the civil society is more of how you live in community, and you can still be in a religious community. But ultimately, you'd still be alienated. But in the state, you may have rights. Right.
That's something interesting to note as well. Is this is almost, you could say, the origin of identity politics is kind of dividing citizens by religion and sort of social standing instead of just sort of like where they identify themselves. Yeah. So he kind of says, this is a quote from his on the Jewish question as well. This says, the decomposition of man into Jew and citizen, Protestant and citizen, religious man and citizen is neither a deception directed against citizenhood, nor is it a circumvention of political emancipation. It is political emancipation itself, the political method of emancipating oneself from religion. So that's something interesting as well, as kind of seeing where he kind of sees citizenship even lying. Like what is the ideal citizen for Marx? Like, is it a religious person? Is it someone that's free from religion? Is it someone who is more materialist like himself, or does he see kind of a positivity with, discourse with people who think differently?
Yeah, I think there's a misconception here of Marxism for sure. I think in America, communism and Marxism is just a byword, as in maybe Europe, as in the manifesto seems to open up with as well. But I think he's for the emancipation of mankind. Marx is ultimately for the human realization of its essence, right? The summation, the synthesis of being fully human. And so for Marx, religion is an imaginary flower, and I think of that. I think his description is so apt and so poignant in that it gives the sense that it's real and beauty and fragrant, but the plastic flower, when we drive to work, there's a graveyard, many acres and many graves, and it's all colored and flowers are everywhere. But you look closer and you find out what actually is required by the local mortuary and by the funeral homes, right, are required. If you're going to bury somebody there, you need to have plastic flowers. You can't put real flowers in. You know, what? I mean, that's the expression. That's kind of the alienation. You're going to memorialize somebody with plastic flowers. I mean, it has the appearance of beauty and a good sentiment, but don't put plastic flowers on my graveside, right? I mean, it's an illusion, right? It's a chain. And so I think that's where Marx ultimately is. You may think it's beautiful, you may think it's self-expressive, and it certainly does get at the yearnings of the heart, but it's religion is not the full realization of being human, right? It's not the full realization of being a man.
So I guess the next obvious question would be, what is the full realization of humanity for Marx? Like, is there any value at all to religion in a sort of corporate society? Is there anything beneficial about having sort of an idealist faith?
Yeah, I think Marx is an idealist. I think we can say that. When you think of communism being idealistic in terms that Marx seems to think, right? It's this Hegelian dialectic is just going to work itself out through these stages, and it seems that it'll just naturally, in terms of evolution, just evolve to the next stage, and we would be able to, like Rousseau, live in society, and we're born free without having the chains any longer, right? All you have to do is lose the chains. Now that's a process for sure, but once you lose the chains, what is the full essence of human being? I think it's in every way you're connected to nature, right? You're connected to each other. You're connected to sociability. I mean, it's a social reality, right? We're social beings. So I think egoism, and I think certainly selfishness, war. I mean, for Marx, all social problems are the heart, right, of this conflict and this private property. So once we get out of that private property and the property question, and the full realization of what it means to be human. And I think we can go back to primitive communism and kind of get our essence. So if we're talking about Marxism and Hegelianism or Aristotelian influence here, you can really think to the primitive communist stage as the seed form, as the essence of what is ultimately becoming, right? So communism would be the final synthesis of what, right? Of the process of what has already been here, right? Being human in our societal structure. So, the primitive communism tribal society seems to be, again, for Marx, for Rousseau, the noble savage idea. But it's working out with all the material benefits of technology, with all the power of the world and global society, right? So it's something that he thinks is just going to be a natural turning, a natural evolutionary synthesis. It's not that we negate it and get rid of it all. And I think that's what Marx is dealing with. And maybe you see that here in more than his other writings, that you can't fully, as he talked about Luther, he was so close, right? The German emancipation, he was so close. Yet he was the theological answer, right? He wasn't the materialist answer. It was still the idealist answer, right? It was just the idealism of the heart, turned toward the heart. Where Marx is saying now the full German Reformation is at hand, and the philosophers are in charge, right? Which is the full essence of truth, is the philosophical truth. Religion being a symbol, right? And the arts being a symbol, but philosophy being the highest realization, and the statements of truth, the essence of truth.
So I guess if Marx's understanding of the ultimate, I guess, chief end of man being as close to nature as possible, and kind of emancipating themselves from class or religion, I guess that sort of explains why he would see Jews certainly at the bottom of that, because they're kind of the beginning of classism, where classes were derived with the basically origin of capitalism, which he believes to be kind of the fault of the Jews. And then that would be kind of why I guess he sees a sort of more moderate view on Christianity, whereas they're not as far gone as the Jews, but they're still not grasping the full picture, quite like you put with Luther. He's so close to that German emancipation. So how would Marx say that he himself kind of fulfilled his fulfillment? Like where does he lie on that spectrum of succeeding at the chief end of man in his own kind of philosophy?
That's a great question. I think I'm not entirely sure how he, at the end, I know he had some misgivings about his early philosophy. So when we're talking about this, and he's working it out, right? With Engels and Marx are working it out for 30 years. They're writing. He gives some warnings even to his older theories that it's maybe not so deterministic, that it doesn't have to go through all these stages. So I think you're at the height, at least in this writing here, at his most ardent idealist kind of self, as he's going to get kicked out of Paris, right, Brussels, as he lives a life of poverty and literally his children dying because of his lack of means, and suffering with his wife, just wearing on him over the next 30 years. Put some, wish the revolution came sooner. He was being crushed by capitalism, right, and by the economic systems, institutions of society. So, interesting figure. I don't think he ever saw it. I think they thought it would come sooner, right? And so have Marxists to this day. Why didn't it happen in Germany so soon, so quickly? It was just ultimately crushed, right? And ultimately, politically maybe got some ends made with child labor and public education, and certainly in Britain and Germany sooner than America. But the process was much more piecemeal and painful than he hoped, right? Than he thought he was ready for the German emancipation.
So I just have two more questions for you, and then we'll let you go. But so by the time that our main figure of the research that I've been doing, Menno Berg, dies from, he was one of the first victims, actually, of the cholera epidemic.
What's his life? What's his time frame here?
He was born in 1789 and dies in 1853.
Okay.
So he lives about 60 years. So yeah, that's actually kind of going on what I was going to ask you. So our character dies 1853. How is Marx's work being kind of accepted and sort of thought about from 1853 over into the early 20th century? Kind of that move, because obviously we see a lot more Marxist thinking and neo-Marxist as well, kind of going through that modern, postmodern era. Yeah. So where does that shift kind of happen from Marx's near anonymity to kind of blowing into this huge movement?
Yeah. I mean, by his death, Engels is going to eulogize him to say one of his greatest achievements was creating the International Working Men's Association, right, in his lifetime. Wish it were, any man to do one thing in life. Marx did many others, published in many different fields. And, he was like how Engels puts him. He said he's a Darwin and like a Newton, right? He discovers the law of motion of capitalism, and he discovered the laws of human history, right? And like Darwin discovered the organic nature, right? So Marx certainly had a political voice, and people were, particularly in Paris, right, taken by him. Interesting to note when I read Weber, who was a German sociologist, at one of the first German associations, the first coming together of sociologists in a professional setting, Weber makes the comment that, why is everyone talking about Marx? Why are all the papers talking about Marx? And Weber, was a scholar known as quite the philosopher, and basically a PhD and postdoc, and was considered the next great, German theorist. So in 1904, he's hearing Marx, and Weber offers a critique of Marx, and it seemed to be pretty clear to him that why are we still talking about Marx when it didn't happen? It didn't come to pass, right? He's a one-dimensional theorist, Everything is based on economics, determines it all. He's after the laws of society. And Weber's thinking, aren't we getting past this yet? Right? Why is that rational to us? Why do we want to deal with that? That's not the human sciences or social science we want any part of, right? The materialist, one-dimensional man, right? And it didn't come to pass, so it's like a failed prophecy, right? Why are we talking about it? But again, Weber's going to live through the early 20th century, World War I, and communism hasn't even got started yet, right? In real political terms. So I think there's certainly underestimation, and I think particularly in France with the already intellectual community from Saint-Simon and Rousseau and the French Revolution, that you have much more resonance with kind of socialist, communist ideas than you do maybe in Germany. I'm not aware of kind of a lot of the German historical evolution. So I just speak from, at least in France, I know it's well pronounced. And I think in Britain, the empiricist bent and, kind of the Darwinist Spencer, right? Social Darwinism, survival of the fittest as being the best answer for society, right? Is gaining traction at that time. Although, Marx lives peacefully, I guess, in poverty in England anyway. So I'm not sure that answered your question, but.
That's all right. Yeah, my last question would kind of be, I guess you kind of mentioned with Weber, kind of this move, at least that he noticed, or at least he didn't think it was very significant, but kind of this move of kind of seeing economics as the king of all instead of kind of this class, or it was very class oriented, but instead of moving kind of from a racial and tribalistic sense more into this economic division of classes, which we still see today, obviously, and I think will become more pronounced in the coming years as well. But how do you think Marx would have interpreted the albeit weak attempts that communism has been given in the East? And do you think it would ever succeed in a Western country? I think diversity has a lot to play with how these sort of economic system works. So I don't personally think that it would work very well in a Western country. Just because diversity alone has so much value that we've given it, where I think it would be very difficult to kind of get something like that moving. But do you think that it would have any success in a Western country, and how do you think he would measure it to his own standards as it's been tried?
Yeah, I think in the manifesto, it has a pretty large section on the failed attempts of socialism, right? And what he's not saying. He's not talking about a bourgeois revolution. He's not talking about kind of a Bernie Sanders, right? In our present American situation, he wants a full emancipation, right? And the eradication of private property, right? And then once you take that element of private property out and private families, right, you get rid of the greatest mechanism of creating inequality. And so if you take that out, then I guess by essence you would create equality, right? So now how can that equality be realized? I think to your point is, well, you got diversity of civil society, right? You got the diversity of culture and what it means to people. So how do you have socialism, communism with people from different languages, different religions, different ethnicities, right? I think that's what you're saying, right? Is that you couldn't have sameness, right? You couldn't have equal outcome because everyone doesn't define their needs the same, right? Or their wants the same. And I think maybe that is certainly the critique, right? Of kind of Marxism and how can it be realized? And I think Weber, I would side with Weber that, we are a multidimensional being, and having the full expression of our humanness is quite unique and varied, and that makes us, beautifully human. But what scares me the most, as a sociologist looking at our modern age, is that, the standardization, right, of our culture, the standardization of academics, everything is being standardized. That's kind of the great bureaucratic machine that is moving toward this oneness and sameness, right, of administration. That is certainly one-dimensional, and I think in that sense, I think it's frighteningly here in certain ways, right? I think, maybe the one voice, the one, it's kind of the political correct, movement. Do we celebrate diversity? Right? I mean, we say we do, but we really, only how we interpret it, right? Only as we know it, right? So,
I mean, you could even say only the diversity that our culture allows us to value.
Yeah, right.
Like, do you value the diversity of race? Do you value the diversity of experience? I mean, what kind of diversity do you value?
Yeah, right.
Another thing I was going to bring up just quickly is you kind of mentioned standardization.
Yeah.
There's an interesting new theory kind of going around on Pareto distribution.
Yeah, the Pareto effect. Oh, that's a very old theory.
Well, it's been newly relevant.
Yeah.
But,
people discovered it, maybe.
Yeah. Basically, this difference in standardized versus Pareto distribution. So I just wondered if you had anything to say on this, because a lot of people think that wealth often becomes standardized and sort of distributed over a standard deviation system. So there's a peak in the middle and it stays in the middle class or whatever it is. And there's extremities on the lower class end and the higher class end, when in reality it's wealth specifically, and inequality as well, is much more defined on the extremities. So there's the large extremes of inequality, where the largest section of people experience the most inequality, and the same thing is true for wealth as well, where the smallest number of people own more wealth than anyone else in the world. Right. So I just wondered if you had anything to add to that as well.
No, I think you're right. Yeah, I think the Pareto effect is something I think it's to be rediscovered for our age. And again, the energy, the societal energy it would take to create equality or standardization would be draconian, would be, and I think about the power of the state today. Here we are, quarantined, right? Colossal feat. I mean, in 330 million people. And in the state we're in, we're going to be opening up on Monday, I guess, more so. But the power of the state that it'll take to make sure everyone is equal or everyone has the same opportunities is itself going to be a frightening reality for administration, a frightening bureaucratic nightmare. And I think Weber says it well when he says, when he's sitting, again, I think early 20th century, writing about bureaucracy, what he sees ahead is not a summer's bloom for society, but an icy winter, right? And I go back, and maybe I'll end with this statement. I think our founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson, was well said when he quoted the Latin Roman phrase that I prefer the dangers, the perilousness, I think, right, of liberty than to the quiet of solitude or the quiet of slavery, servitude, right? And the bureaucratic state is creating servants, right? The bureaucratic educational institution is creating instructors, right? Not free-thinking professors, right? The political correctness movement, and it's a dangerous notion. And I can just think that maybe in your generation, again, the youth generation seems to be more awakened to this now, and maybe this movement of the coronavirus will help us imagine it's dangerous to be free, physically dangerous, right? But I rather prefer that, right, than to a life of servitude, to the quiet of servitude and being, alienated and not becoming and not being full.
Thank you for joining us, and I hope you enjoyed the podcast. I'll see you next time.